In the spring of 1812, when the roads dried from winter's thaw, and the fields greened with new growth, and the promise of campaign season returned to Europe as it did each year, an army gathered along the Niemen River, not merely an army, but a civilization in motion, a force unprecedented in European history for its size and diversity. 500,000 men drawn from across Napoleon's empire, and from allied states that owed him allegiance or feared his power. We begin with the immensity of what was being assembled: soldiers who spoke French and German and Italian and Polish and Dutch, who came from Paris and Hamburg and Milan and Warsaw, who wore the uniforms of a dozen different nations, but who marched under the imperial eagles that represented Napoleon's authority, who were organized into corps and divisions and regiments that together constituted the Grande Armée, the great army that was the instrument of Napoleon's will and the manifestation of his power. The gathering took months. The concentration of forces along Russia's border required logistical planning on scale never before attempted, required moving hundreds of thousands of men and their equipment and supplies across Europe, required coordinating movements so that forces would arrive when and where needed, required creating supply depots and organizing transport and establishing the infrastructure that would supposedly sustain the army during the campaign into Russia. The planners worked from maps that showed distances and cities and rivers, from reports about Russian forces and Russian intentions, from the accumulated experience of previous campaigns, where Napoleon had triumphed through combination of superior numbers and brilliant tactics, and the speed of movement that allowed him to concentrate forces at decisive points and overwhelm enemies before they could respond effectively. It is said that Napoleon believed this campaign would be like previous campaigns, that Russian army would be forced to stand and fight to defend Moscow or St. Petersburg, that decisive battle would be won through French tactical superiority, and Russian morale would break, and Tsar Alexander would negotiate peace that would confirm Napoleon's dominance and would secure eastern border of French Empire, allowing Napoleon to focus attention elsewhere, on Spain, where guerrilla war continued to drain French resources, or on other challenges to his authority. The campaign was expected to last several months, would begin in June when weather was favorable, would conclude before winter with treaty that would add Russia to list of nations that had been defeated and that had accepted Napoleon's primacy in European affairs. We descend now into what soldiers experienced as the army gathered the marches from garrisons across Europe, toward the concentration areas. The growing understanding that this campaign would be different from previous ones, that the distances involved were greater than anything they had experienced before, that Russia was larger and less developed than the countries where previous campaigns had been fought. The mixture of confidence born from years of victories and anxiety born from uncertainty about what Russia would be like, about whether supply system would function at such distances, about whether the campaign that seemed straightforward in planning would prove manageable in execution. The veterans who had fought in previous campaigns tried to prepare newer soldiers for what campaign life entailed: the long marches, the improvised camps, the necessity of foraging when supplies were inadequate, the dangers beyond combat, including disease and accident and exhaustion, the skills required for surviving conditions that peacetime life did not prepare anyone for. The army that gathered was spectacle: hundreds of thousands of men in formation, cavalry units with thousands of horses, artillery trains with hundreds of guns, supply wagons stretching for miles, the physical manifestation of French military power, the visible evidence of what Napoleon had built over decades of wars, the force that was supposed to be invincible because it had never been truly defeated, because it carried the momentum of victory after victory, because it embodied the revolutionary energy and the imperial organization that together had made France dominant power in Europe. Observers who watched the army pass described it in terms usually reserved for natural phenomena, compared it to rivers in flood, to migrations of ancient peoples, to forces of nature that could not be resisted, the hyperbole reflecting genuine awe at the scale of what was being assembled, and at the ambition that such assembly represented. Whispers tell us of the optimism that pervaded the army as invasion began, the belief that Moscow was an achievable objective, that Russian forces would be defeated in battle, or would simply give way before French advance. That campaign would be concluded successfully before serious cold arrived, that veterans would have new victories to add to their records, and newer soldiers would prove themselves in combat that would be difficult but manageable. The confidence that came from belonging to army that seemed invincible, from serving emperor who seemed unbeatable, from being part of enterprise that seemed certain to succeed, because all previous enterprises had succeeded, and because there seemed to be no reason why this one would be different. The songs that soldiers sang as they marched were songs of confidence: La victoire enchantante, Valens au salut de l'Empire. the martial music that had accompanied previous campaigns, and that seemed appropriate for this one. The rhythm of drums and the sound of voices raised in unison, creating atmosphere of purpose and strength, and the unity that military music was designed to foster and reinforce. We witnessed the crossing of the Niemen River on June 24, 1812. The pontoon bridges that engineers constructed to carry the army across the boundary between Napoleon's empire and Russian territory. The columns of soldiers and horses and wagons passing over bridges and entering Russia. The symbolic significance of crossing that marked campaigns beginning, that committed the army to invasion. That was point of no return, not because returning was physically impossible, but because returning without achieving objectives would be admission of failure that Napoleon would not accept. Some soldiers looked back as they crossed, saw the western bank where Europe ended, and wondered when they would see it again. Wondered whether the confidence they felt was justified, or whether something they could not yet see awaited them in the vastness ahead. Wondered briefly before continuing forward, because the army was moving and individuals moved with it, and there was no real choice except to cross and to continue. We sit with what was being left behind, the Europe that Napoleon dominated, the empire that had been built through decade of warfare, the civilization that soldiers came from, and that they expected to return to after campaign's conclusion, the families and homes and lives that would continue during soldiers' absence, and that soldiers hoped to return to unchanged. Though war always changed those who fought it, and sometimes changed those who waited as well. The letters that soldiers had received before crossing carried news of births and deaths and marriages and harvests, and the ordinary progress of life that continued despite the wars. The domestic details that seemed remote now, but that represented the world that soldiers fought for, or at least fought to return to. The normalcy that military life suspended, but that soldiers hoped would resume when campaigning ended. We reflect on armies as expressions of will, the massing of force that represents determination to achieve objectives through violence if necessary. The organization of humans into military units that transforms individuals into instruments of state power. The crossing of borders that commits nations to courses of action that will result in death and suffering and changes that cannot be predicted or controlled. The moment when political decisions become military realities. When abstract planning becomes concrete marching. When maps become territories that must be traversed and conquered. When confidence must be tested against resistance and distance, and all the factors that planning can account for only imperfectly. We close with the army in motion eastward, spread across multiple roads because single road could not accommodate such numbers. The columns advancing into Russia with standards flying and drums beating, and the confidence of those who had never been truly defeated, marching toward Moscow that was marked on maps as destination, toward the campaign that would prove different from all previous campaigns, toward the winter that waited months ahead, toward the catastrophe that confidence blinded them to. The army moving forward while behind them the bridges remained for now but would eventually be taken down, while ahead the distances opened and the Russian army retreated before them and the strategy of space and time and winter began its work of destroying what seemed invincible. The army, the crossing, the confidence, the march toward winter's throne, forever advancing, forever believing, forever the moment before everything changed, before the distances revealed themselves, before the cold came, before the grand armée that crossed the Niemen ceased to exist in any form resembling what it had been. The army that marched toward winter's throne, forever confident, forever doomed, forever the beginning of the end, forever. In Napoleon's headquarters that traveled with the army, in the command tents where decisions were made and orders were issued, maps were spread across tables, careful cartographic representations created by French geographers and military surveyors, showing Russia's western territories with cities marked, and rivers traced and roads indicated, showing Moscow as point on map that could be reached through military movement, showing the distance from Niemen to Moscow as approximately 1,000 kilometers that army could cover in several months of marching, showing the terrain and the settlements and the features that armies needed to know about when planning campaigns and conducting operations. We begin with the map as tool of power, the representation of space that allowed commanders to visualize campaigns before executing them, to calculate distances and timings, to identify objectives and routes, to plan supply operations and coordinate movements. The map as essential instrument of modern warfare that transformed territory from unknown space into comprehensible information. That gave commanders confidence that they understood what they were undertaking and could control execution through planning based on accurate geographic knowledge. The maps showed cities Vilnius and Vitebsk and Smolensk and Moscow, marked with symbols indicating their size and importance, connected by roads that were drawn as lines, suggesting reliable routes for military movement. surrounded by territory that was shown as either populated agricultural land or as forest or as open steppe. The cartographic conventions creating impression of legible landscape, where armies could move according to plan, and where supplies could be obtained from countryside through requisition or purchase, and where Russian forces could be brought to battle at locations that French commanders would choose based on strategic considerations. The maps were based on best available information reports from diplomats and travelers who had visited Russia. Older maps created by Russian cartographers that had been obtained through various means. Intelligence gathered by French agents who had studied Russian geography in preparation for campaign that had been considered for years before it was finally launched. The cartography was as accurate as 18th century map making could achieve. The major features were correctly shown. The distances were approximately right. The cities existed where maps said they existed. It is said that Napoleon studied these maps constantly, would pore over them planning movements, would trace routes with his finger calculating how long marches would take, and where supply depots should be established, would identify points where Russian forces might make stands, and where French forces should concentrate, would use maps to transform abstract strategy into concrete operational plans. The maps serving as interface between Napoleon's strategic vision and the physical reality that army would encounter. The confidence in maps reflecting confidence in ability to control campaign through planning and through understanding of terrain that maps provided. The headquarters staff who assisted in planning worked from same maps, calculated supply requirements based on distances shown, planned marches based on roads indicated, identified river crossings and potential battlefield sites based on topographic features that maps revealed. The entire apparatus of military planning depending on maps' accuracy, and on assumption that map represented reality adequately for planning purposes. We descend now into the gap between map and territory, the difference between what cartography showed and what soldiers actually encountered as they marched eastward into Russia. The roads that maps showed as reliable routes often proved to be little more than tracks through countryside, were unpaved paths that turned to mud in rain, and that produced dust clouds in dry weather, were inadequate for the volume of traffic that Grande Armée generated, were so poor that wagons broke down constantly, and that artillery movement was slowed to crawl, and that the smooth flow of supplies that planning had assumed proved impossible to achieve. The villages that maps showed as settlements where supplies could be obtained proved smaller and poorer than expected, were often just clusters of wooden houses with limited food stores, could not support passage of army corps numbering tens of thousands, were sometimes abandoned by inhabitants who fled before French arrival, taking portable possessions and destroying what could not be carried. The scorched earth policy that Russians would increasingly employ, making maps indications of inhabited territory meaningless, because inhabitants were gone, and structures were burned, and supplies were destroyed. The distances that maps showed as abstract measurements revealed themselves as concrete suffering kilometers that could be traced with ruler on map, had to be walked by soldiers carrying equipment weighing 30 kilograms or more, had to be covered day after day in heat that reached oppressive levels during Russian summer, had to be traversed without adequate supplies because supply system could not keep pace with armies' advance. The physical reality of distance being fundamentally different from cartographic representation of distance. The soldier's experience of marching being determined not by what maps showed, but by condition of roads and availability of water and temperature and exhaustion that accumulated with each day's march, factors that maps could not capture, and that planning had inadequately accounted for. Whispers tell us of the realization that developed among commanders as campaign progressed, the understanding that maps had misled not through showing false information, but through failing to show crucial information, through representing Russia as more similar to Central Europe than it actually was, through suggesting that distances were manageable when those distances combined with poor infrastructure and hostile climate created challenges that exceeded what planning had prepared for. The empty spaces on maps, the areas between cities and rivers, where cartographers had simply left paper blank or had indicated generic territory, proved to contain the actual challenge, were where armies' strength was sapped not through combat, but through the grinding attrition of long marches through country that offered nothing, where soldiers died of exhaustion and disease and hunger without ever engaging enemy forces, where the vastness that maps could show, but could not make commanders feel, revealed itself as weapon more effective than Russian armies. We witness the evolution of French strategy as maps' inadequacy became apparent, the recognition that Russian army was refusing to stand and fight decisive battle that Napoleon sought, that Russians were trading space for time, and were drawing Grande Armée deeper into territory where supply lines grew longer, and where army grew weaker. that the strategy of rapid movement and decisive battle that had worked in previous campaigns was not working here because Russians were not cooperating, were not following the script that French planning had assumed they would follow, were using Russia's geography against invaders in ways that European opponents had not been able to do because they lacked Russia's vast territory to trade for French exhaustion. The maps showed Moscow as objective but did not show how to force Russians to defend it, did not show how to achieve the decisive result that was supposed to follow from capturing enemy's capital, did not prepare French commanders for possibility that taking Moscow would mean nothing if Tsar refused to negotiate, and if Russian forces remained intact, and if occupation could not be sustained through winter that was approaching. We sit with soldiers' experience of the gap between map and reality, the marches that were longer than they expected based on distances that officers announced, the supplies that failed to arrive because supply officers had calculated based on map distances and map roads, and had not accounted for actual conditions. The exhaustion that exceeded what seemed reasonable for distances covered. The growing understanding among common soldiers that something was wrong with the campaign, even if they could not articulate what exactly was wrong, that the conquest that had seemed straightforward was proving much more difficult than expected, that Russia was different from countries they had campaigned in before, and that the difference was working against them in ways they could feel but could not fully comprehend. We reflect on maps as representations that can deceive through their comprehensiveness, the complete-looking map, suggesting complete knowledge when actual knowledge was fragmentary. The neat lines and symbols creating impression of control when actual control was limited. The reduction of complex reality to simple graphic representation, losing information that proved crucial. The confidence that maps provided being false confidence when maps' limitations were not recognized or were not adequately accounted for in planning. The maps had shown distance to Moscow, had been accurate in that narrow sense, but had not shown what covering that distance would cost, had not shown that achieving objective would not achieve victory, had not prepared anyone for campaign that would succeed in capturing Moscow, but would fail in every way that mattered. We close contemplating map spread on table in headquarters tent, Moscow marked with circle or star, routes traced showing armies advance, the cartographic representation showing campaign as series of movements across represented space, the map suggesting success objectives reached, territories crossed, cities occupied while reality outside tent was deterioration and suffering and slow dissolution of army that maps could not show, and that planning based on maps had not prevented. The map that showed Moscow as reachable destination, but that had not shown the cost of reaching it or the meaninglessness of the achievement. The map that represented space, but not what space would do to army traversing it. The map that was accurate in details but wrong in what it promised, that led army forward but could not lead it back. That was tool of power that failed when power met realities that cartography could not capture. The map, the distances shown, the distances experienced, forever different. Forever the gap between representation and reality. Forever the map that showed Moscow but not the distance between. Forever. In September 1812, after 3 months of advancing through Russian territory, after fighting several battles that had been tactically successful but strategically inconclusive, after covering the 1,000 kilometers that separated the Niemen River from Moscow, the Grand Armée finally entered the city that had been campaign's objective from the beginning, the ancient capital of Russia, the city of golden domes and historic significance. The place where Napoleon had expected to dictate terms of peace to Tsar Alexander, and to conclude campaign victoriously before winter arrived. We begin with the entry, the soldiers marching through streets that were strangely empty, the absence of the crowds that had greeted French armies in other captured cities, the silence that was unsettling after the noise of marching and campaigning, the realization that Moscow had been largely evacuated, that civilian population had fled, that the governor and officials had departed, that the city was abandoned shell rather than living capital. That victory felt hollow because there was no one to surrender to, and no authority to negotiate with, and no recognition of defeat that occupation was supposed to force. The expectation had been different. Napoleon had believed that Tsar would not allow Moscow to fall without making peace, that losing ancient capital would be politically unacceptable, that occupation would demonstrate futility of continued resistance, and would bring Russia to negotiating table. That campaign would end here with treaty that would confirm Napoleon's dominance and would allow Grand Armée to return westward to comfortable quarters before winter truly began. But Alexander did not negotiate, sent no envoys, made no offers, remained in St. Petersburg and gave no indication that Moscow's fall had changed anything, that he was prepared to accept peace on terms that Napoleon would find acceptable. The silence from St. Petersburg was more devastating than military defeat, would have been was refusal to acknowledge that Napoleon had won anything, was insistence that campaign would continue, was rejection of all assumptions that French planning had been based on. It is said that fires began within days of French occupation, small blazes at first that seemed accidental, then larger conflagrations that spread rapidly through wooden structures that comprised much of Moscow's architecture, then massive fire that consumed vast sections of city, and that burned for days despite attempts to extinguish it, the flames visible from kilometers away, the smoke creating pall that hung over city and made breathing difficult and turned day into twilight, the heat forcing soldiers to evacuate areas they had just occupied, the destruction of supplies and shelter that army had expected to find, and that were being consumed before they could be used. The fires were deliberate, were part of scorched earth strategy that Russian governor had implemented, were Moscow's self-immolation chosen over submission, were Russian willingness to destroy their own capital rather than let it sustain occupying army, were demonstration of determination that shocked French soldiers who could not imagine their own government choosing to burn Paris rather than see it occupied. We descend into soldiers' experience of the burning city, the initial excitement of reaching Moscow giving way to confusion as fires spread, the scramble to save supplies from warehouses before flames reached them, the looting that occurred as discipline broke down, and soldiers took what they could find before fires destroyed it, the surreal quality of being in ancient capital that was burning around them, the nights illuminated by flames that created apocalyptic atmosphere, the smoke and heat and the ash that fell like snow, the destruction of city that had been goal transforming goal into catastrophe, even as it was supposedly being achieved. Some soldiers fought fires, organized bucket brigades, or demolished buildings to create fire breaks while others looted or simply watched as city burned. The breakdown of military order was visible in how soldiers responded were no longer organized units following commands, but were individuals or small groups pursuing own interests in chaos of burning city. The discipline that had been maintained during march dissolving in absence of clear mission, and in presence of abandoned city that offered plunder but also danger. The supplies that army desperately needed were consumed by flames. Food stores that could have sustained soldiers through winter were burned. Warehouses containing equipment were destroyed. Housing that could have sheltered army during occupation was reduced to ash. The city that was supposed to solve Grand Armée's supply problems instead became additional problem, as fires eliminated resources that planning had assumed would be available. The calculation had been that Moscow would provide that city of 250,000 people would contain food and materiel sufficient for supporting occupying army, that soldiers could rest and recover from exhausting march in shelter of buildings rather than in field camps, that winter could be spent in relative comfort while negotiations proceeded. The fires destroyed all these assumptions, left army occupying ruins rather than city, left soldiers without adequate shelter or supplies with winter approaching, left Napoleon without the leverage he had expected occupation to provide. Whispers tell us of Napoleon's stay in Kremlin, the fortified complex at Moscow's center that survived fires, where Napoleon established headquarters and waited for message from Tsar that never came, where he spent weeks in denial about strategic situation, refusing to acknowledge that occupying Moscow meant nothing if Tsar refused to negotiate. That campaign had failed in its essential objective, even though army had captured city it had marched toward. The messages that Napoleon sent to Alexander went unanswered, or were answered with vague statements that indicated no willingness to make peace. The time past days became weeks. September became October while Napoleon delayed ordering retreat because retreat would be admission of failure, because occupying Moscow was supposed to be victory, and leaving Moscow without achieving peace would make it clear that occupation had accomplished nothing, that all the suffering of 3-month advance had been for nothing. That campaign would end not with treaty, but with humiliating withdrawal. We witnessed the growing desperation as October progressed. The soldiers understood that staying in Moscow through winter was impossible because supplies were inadequate. That retreat was becoming necessary, but that Napoleon was not ordering it, that each day of delay made eventual retreat more dangerous as weather worsened, and as time available for reaching friendly territory before deep winter decreased. The looting continued, soldiers taking whatever seemed valuable or useful, stripping city of anything portable. The discipline that had dissolved during occupation not being restored, because officers recognized that retreat was imminent, and that enforcing discipline seemed pointless when army's situation was becoming desperate. The mood shifted from initial relief at reaching Moscow to anxiety about leaving it, from victory to recognition that victory had been illusion, from confidence to fear about what retreat through devastated countryside in approaching winter would entail. We sit with the psychological impact of cities burning. The message that Russian action sent was clear. We will accept destruction rather than submission. We value resistance more than preservation. We are willing to sacrifice everything rather than grant you victory. We recognize that time and winter and space are our allies, and that you have walked into trap from which extraction will be more difficult than you anticipated. The burning of Moscow was not desperation, was strategic choice that demonstrated Russian determination, and that shifted psychological balance by showing that French had not won anything by reaching Moscow, that occupation was burden rather than achievement. That city that had been represented as goal was actually death trap that army should have avoided rather than destination it should have sought. We reflect on cities as symbols that can be destroyed when preservation means defeat. The Russian understanding that Moscow's symbolic importance made it valuable. But that symbolic value could not trump strategic necessity. That losing city but maintaining resistance was better outcome than defending city, but losing army that could continue fighting. That cities can be rebuilt, but nations that submit to conquest are harder to restore. The French, who could not imagine such calculation, who came from tradition where cities were preserved if possible, where civilian suffering was minimized when practical, where occupation was supposed to lead to negotiation rather than to continued resistance, were shocked by Russian willingness to burn their own capital, and could not effectively respond to strategy that violated their assumptions about how warfare was supposed to function. We close with Napoleon finally ordering retreat on October 19, after wasting 5 weeks waiting for negotiations that would never happen, leaving city that was mostly destroyed. Understanding that occupation had accomplished nothing, that campaign had failed despite reaching its geographic objective, that the Grande Armée would now have to march back through territory already devastated by its advance, through autumn that was turning to winter, toward safety that was 1,000 kilometers distant, through hostile territory where Russian forces would harass every step. The burning city behind them was monument to Russian determination, and to French failure was testimony that goals achieved could still be defeats if goals proved meaningless, that occupying capitals did not guarantee winning wars, that strategy of destruction could defeat strategy of conquest. The city, the flames, the ruins, the silence from St. Petersburg. The retreat beginning too late, forever burning, forever testimony, forever the city that burned rather than surrender, forever. In October, when the Grande Armée finally left Moscow, and began its retreat westward. The cold was bearable, was autumn chill that soldiers could endure with the coats and equipment they carried, was temperature that Europeans understood because they had experienced similar conditions in France or Germany or Italy during late autumn, was not yet the enemy that would kill more effectively than all Russian armies combined, that would reduce the retreating army more thoroughly than any battle could, that would transform soldiers into desperate refugees, and would turn organized military force into mob of individuals focused solely on survival. We begin with the first days of retreat, the army still substantially intact, though diminished by combat and disease and desertion that had occurred during advance and occupation. Perhaps 100,000 combatants plus thousands of camp followers, and wounded who were being evacuated, and civilians who attached themselves to army hoping for protection. The forces still organized into recognizable units, still carrying equipment and some supplies, still believing that reaching friendly territory before deep winter was achievable if they moved steadily westward, still underestimating both the distances involved and the season that was approaching. But November brought transformation. The cold that had been uncomfortable became dangerous. The temperatures that had required extra clothing became temperatures that threatened life. The autumn that soldiers understood gave way to Russian winter that exceeded anything most had experienced. That was qualitatively different from European winters, that killed not through the gradual weakening that moderate cold causes, but through the acute danger that extreme cold creates, through the frostbite that blackened extremities within hours of exposure, through the hypothermia that made people confused and sleepy, and then dead, through the simple brutal fact that human bodies cannot maintain core temperature indefinitely when external temperature drops far below freezing, and when fuel in form of food is inadequate to power the metabolic furnaces that keep humans alive in extreme cold. The transformation from bearable to unbearable happened quickly. Soldiers who had been managing found themselves suddenly in desperate circumstances as temperature dropped, as snow began falling regularly, as wind created conditions that were more lethal than temperature alone would suggest. It is said that the cold killed in multiple ways: the immediate freezing of exposed skin, the slower development of frostbite in extremities that were inadequately protected, the hypothermia that developed in those whose clothing was insufficient or who were weakened by hunger or disease or exhaustion, the deaths during sleep when soldiers huddled for warmth but whose bodies could not generate enough heat to survive through night, and who were found frozen in mourning in positions they had assumed while resting. The deaths of those who sat down to rest and could not or did not stand up again, and who froze where they sat marking retreat route, with corpses that remained visible through winter, because cold preserved them. The overnight camps became sites of mass death. Soldiers would camp wherever darkness found them, would huddle in whatever shelter could be found or improvised, would try to sleep despite cold, and would wake to find comrades frozen beside them, or would themselves not wake because cold had killed during night. The camps marked by growing numbers of frozen corpses that survivors would leave behind as army continued westward. We descend into the experience of extreme cold from perspective of soldiers who endured it. The initial burning sensation as exposed skin began freezing. The loss of feeling in fingers and toes as circulation was restricted, and tissue began dying. The clumsiness that came as frozen hands could no longer perform simple tasks like tying laces or holding weapons. The exhaustion that cold created as bodies struggled to maintain temperature and burned calories at rates that inadequate rations could not replace. The psychological impact of being constantly cold without any prospect of warmth, of watching extremities turn white then blue then black as frostbite progressed, of understanding that survival required continuing to move even when movement seemed impossible, that stopping to rest might mean freezing during rest, that the cold was enemy that could not be fought or negotiated with, but only endured with no certainty that endurance would prove sufficient. The horses died first and in greatest numbers were less resilient to cold than humans, required more food than was available, weakened rapidly and collapsed and died by thousands along retreat route, their corpses immediately surrounded by starving soldiers who butchered them for meat, who ate flesh raw or barely cooked because fuel for cooking fires was scarce, and because hunger was desperate, who competed for still warm meat in scenes that demonstrated how completely civilization's veneer had been stripped away by necessity. The cavalry that had been proud arm of Grand Armée ceased to exist as horses died. The troopers became infantrymen or became stragglers who could not keep pace with retreating columns. The magnificent animals that had carried soldiers through campaigns across Europe, falling along Russian roads, and being consumed by those who had ridden them. The transformation of cavalry into foot soldiers being one of many ways that cold and starvation were destroying armies' effectiveness, even as army continued retreating. Whispers tell us of the equipment that was abandoned as soldiers weakened, the packs that became too heavy to carry were left by roadsides. The weapons that served no purpose except as burdens were discarded. The artillery pieces that could not be moved without horses were spiked and left behind. The wagons that had carried wounded or supplies were abandoned when horses died, and when soldiers were too weak to pull them. The systematic stripping away of everything except what was absolutely necessary for immediate survival. The reduction of army to mob of individuals carrying only what they could manage, and focused only on continuing to move westward toward safety, that seemed infinitely distant. The transformation of military force with organization and equipment and purpose into desperate refugees, whose only purpose was surviving to next day or next hour. We witnessed the frozen dead that lined retreat route, the corpses that marked every kilometer with testimony to cold's effectiveness as killer, the bodies in positions that showed final moments of life, sitting or standing or lying in postures that cold had preserved, the faces that showed expressions ranging from peaceful to agonized depending on how consciousness had left them. The accumulation of dead that was so vast that survivors became numb to it, that seeing corpses became ordinary rather than shocking. That individual death ceased to register emotionally, because death was everywhere and constant, and survivors were too focused on own survival to mourn strangers. The pathway of corpses stretching from Moscow back toward Niemen River, creating trail that could be followed by counting dead, that marked Grand Armée's passage with monuments of frozen flesh that would remain until spring thaw months later. We sit with the loss of humanity, that extreme suffering created the survival instincts that overrode social bonds and moral considerations. The soldiers who stole coats from frozen corpses, because own coats were inadequate and dead no longer needed warmth. Who took boots from bodies when own boots had failed. Who fought over scraps of food or over positions near fires. Who abandoned wounded comrades because helping meant dying alongside them. Who became animals focused purely on survival without capacity for compassion or solidarity, or any of the social virtues that peacetime life assumes. The moral collapse that accompanied physical collapse as conditions made maintaining civilized behavior impossible, and made survival require selfishness that shame might follow later, but that immediate circumstances demanded. We reflect on cold as enemy that was more effective than human enemies. The Russian forces that harassed retreat were dangerous, but the cold killed more. The Cossacks who attacked stragglers claimed victims, but the cold claimed thousands for every one that combat took. The artillery that fired on columns caused casualties, but the cold caused casualties continuously without any action required by Russians. The enemy that required no strategy or tactics or courage, but simply existed and killed. That demonstrated limits of military power against natural forces that recognized no authority except their own. That could not be defeated or avoided or overcome, but only endured until either cold released its grip or until it killed. The realization that Grande Armée was being destroyed primarily not by Russian military action, but by Russian weather that asked nothing except that soldiers survive conditions that were unsurvivable for most. We close in deep winter, temperatures far below zero. Army reduced to perhaps 20 or 30,000 who would eventually reach friendly territory out of the 600,000 who had invaded. The vast majority lost to cold and starvation and disease and combat. The frozen corpses marking every mile of retreat route as testimony to campaign that had marched eastward in summer confidence and returned westward in winter catastrophe, that had entered Russia as Grande Armée and left it as desperate remnant, that had challenged empire and been destroyed not primarily by Russian armies but by Russian winter that had no mercy and no limits and no interest in anything except killing through cold, that was implacable and inescapable and ultimately victorious. The cold, the freezing, the death by exposure, the corpses in snow, the enemy without face or mercy, forever killing, forever triumphant, forever the cold that came as enemy no one had prepared for, forever. In late November 1812, as remnants of the Grande Armée retreated westward pursued by Russian forces and decimated by cold and starvation, and the diseases that flourished when humans were weakened and crowded, and without adequate shelter or food, they approached the Berezina River, the final major obstacle between army and relative safety of Polish territory, the barrier that had to be crossed to continue retreat, the place where army's fate would be determined, where engineering and desperation and sacrifice would combine to create crossing that would be remembered for horror it entailed, and for the human cost it exacted, and for the testament it provided to what humans will do to survive when survival becomes sole, remaining purpose. We begin with the situation as army reached river. The water was normally frozen solid by late November, and army could have simply walked across ice. But unseasonable thaw had made river partially liquid, had broken up ice that had formed, had created conditions where water was too deep to ford, but ice was too weak to support crossing. where conventional passage was impossible, and where engineers would have to construct temporary bridges under fire, while thousands waited exposed to Russian artillery and cavalry, and to cold that killed continuously without regard for whether soldiers were moving or stationary or attempting to cross rivers. The engineers worked in conditions that would have been impossible, except that impossibility was not option stood in water that was near freezing temperature, driving pilings into river bottom, laying planks across supports, their bodies going numb from immersion, many dying from hypothermia while working, others drowning when they lost strength and coordination and slipped under surface, the bridges being built through sacrifice of those constructing them, created through human cost that was incalculable, but that was necessary because without bridges the army could not cross, and without crossing the army would be destroyed by pursuing Russians. The engineers, understanding that they were dying as they worked, but working anyway because bridges represented survival for thousands even if not for all, and because duty remained even when death was certain. It is said that 2 bridges were constructed, one for vehicles and artillery, one for infantry, both narrow, both temporary structures that were barely adequate for purpose, and that would not last long under the traffic that would use them, both becoming bottlenecks where tens of thousands tried to cross simultaneously, where crowding would cause collapses and deaths, where panic would transform organized crossing into stampede, where the discipline that had already eroded during retreat would dissolve completely as survival instinct overrode military order and social bonds. The approaches to bridges became scenes of chaos, soldiers and civilians and wagons and artillery trying to reach crossing points, the mass of humanity pressing forward, those at front unable to stop or slow because those behind were pushing, the density of crowd making individual movement impossible, people being carried forward by pressure of mass rather than walking under own power, the compression creating suffocation and crushing injuries even before bridges were reached. We descend now into the crossing itself, the thousands attempting to traverse narrow bridges simultaneously, the wooden planks that were slick with ice and that provided treacherous footing, the rails or ropes that served as handholds being insufficient to prevent falls, the soldiers and civilians who were pushed, or who slipped falling into freezing water where they drowned or died from hypothermia within minutes, the bodies accumulating in water and on ice creating obstacles that complicated crossing for those still attempting it, The crossing that should have been organized military operation becoming desperate scramble, where strong pushed aside weak, where helping others meant risking one's own survival, where the transformation from army to mob was complete and visible in how soldiers treated each other during crossing. The Russian artillery opened fire on bridges and on approaches, shells falling among crowds, causing casualties directly through explosions and indirectly through panic that caused stampedes. The targeting of bridges being obvious tactic, but being no less effective for being obvious. The soldiers caught in open unable to take cover or to disperse being easy targets. The artillery fire making terrible situation catastrophic as crowds tried simultaneously to cross bridges and to avoid falling shells. The impossible choices between rushing forward into danger of falling from bridges or staying still and being hit by artillery, between helping others and helping oneself, between maintaining any semblance of humanity or descending completely into animal survival behavior. Whispers tell us of those who were trampled, the fallen who could not get up because of crowd density, who were stepped on by hundreds trying to pass over them, who died from crushing or suffocation in mud or snow of approach routes, the humanity being literally trampled underfoot by other humans who had no capacity left for compassion or for acknowledgement that those being stepped on were people deserving consideration rather than obstacles to be surmounted. The children who were separated from parents in chaos, the elderly who could not keep pace and who were left behind, the wounded who could not move quickly enough and who were abandoned to capture or death, the casualties that crossing created in addition to casualties that cold and hunger and Russian attacks had already caused, the Berezina becoming synonym for catastrophe, even in history filled with catastrophes. We witness those left behind, the thousands who reached river after bridges had been destroyed or had collapsed under weight of traffic, who were trapped on eastern bank unable to cross, who watched as last soldiers crossed, and as engineers destroyed bridges to prevent Russian use, who understood that their chance for survival had passed because of timing and position and luck that had run out, who would be captured or killed by Russian forces advancing behind them, who had survived march from Moscow only to be stopped meters from safety, who carried for remainder of lives which might be years in captivity or might be hours, until they were killed the knowledge that survival had been so close but had been denied by circumstances beyond their control. We sit with survivors who successfully crossed their relief at reaching Western Bank mixed with guilt at having survived when so many had not, with horror at what they had witnessed and participated in during crossing, with shame at actions they had taken or failed to take when others needed help, with the trauma of having experienced humanity at its worst during hours when crossing occurred, with memories that would remain vivid for rest of lives. That would make Berezina become emblem not just of military defeat, but of moral defeat, of moment when civilization's pretenses were stripped away, and humans revealed themselves as capable of treating each other with cruelty born from desperation that made cruelty seem necessary or at least inevitable. We reflect on bridges as thresholds, physical structures that separate spaces, and that become metaphors for transitions between states, the Berezina bridges being literal crossings from danger toward safety, but also being symbolic crossings from army to mob, from soldier to refugee, from organized military force to desperate individuals, from the remnants of Grand Armée to the survivors who would carry trauma and memory and shame forward into futures that many would struggle to reconcile with experiences they had endured. The bridges built from planks and from the bodies and sacrifices of engineers who died constructing them. The bridges that stood long enough for perhaps 40,000 to cross, but not long enough for all who needed to cross. The bridges that were destroyed behind those who passed, leaving others to fates that varied between captivity and death. We close with crossing complete, bridges destroyed, tens of thousands left on eastern bank, survivors continuing westward reduced to small fraction of force that had invaded 6 months earlier, understanding that they had survived moment when survival had seemed impossible, but that survival had been purchased through loss of comrades who had been equally deserving. That the river had been crossed not through military skill or organization, but through desperate scramble that left bridges constructed partly of engineering and partly of bodies of those who died building them or crossing them, or attempting to cross them. Forever the river that became bridge of bodies, forever the Berezina where armies' remnants crossed or died trying, forever testimony to cost of retreat and to human behavior under extreme duress. Forever the place where Grand Armée's dissolution was completed, and where survival was determined by position in crowd and by strength to push forward and by luck that distributed survival and death with randomness that made any search for justice or meaning futile. The river, the bridges, the bodies, the crossing that was catastrophe, forever flowing, forever dividing, forever threshold between survival and death where tens of thousands remained forever, forever the river that became bridge of bodies. Forever. In the Grande Armée, each regiment carried an imperial eagle bronze standard mounted on staff, topped with bird of prey in proud stance. Wings spread, modeled on Roman aquili that had led legions centuries earlier, presented personally by Napoleon in ceremonies that made standards sacred objects representing regimental honor and direct connection to Emperor himself, symbols that embodied units' identity and history, and the continuity between past victories and present service. Eagles that could never be surrendered without ultimate dishonor, that had to be defended with soldiers' lives if necessary or destroyed, rather than falling into enemy hands, where they would become trophies testifying to French defeat. We begin with eagles as they were in better times standards carried at front of regiments during advances across Europe, focal points during battles where soldiers rallied when lines wavered, objects that connected common soldiers to emperor through physical representation of his authority and favor. Eagles that had been carried through victories at Austerlitz and Jena and Wagram and Friedland, that bore names of those battles engraved on plaques attached to staffs, that represented glory that Grande Armée had achieved, and that soldiers believed they were continuing. Standards that were sacred not in religious sense, but in military sense, where honor and duty and unit pride converged into reverence for symbol that represented all three. The eagles were heavy bronze bird and staff together weighing perhaps 10 kilograms, substantial burden that was normally carried by specially designated officer or senior NCO, who was honored by the responsibility, who marched at specific position in regiment where eagle would be visible to all, where it could serve as rallying point and as symbol of unit's presence, the weight being acceptable when army was well-fed and strong, but becoming significant burden as soldiers weakened during retreat. As every kilogram that had to be carried became ordeal, as equipment and supplies were being abandoned to reduce loads, the eagles being among few things that were not abandoned despite their weight, because of what they represented, and because of dishonor that abandoning them would entail. It is said that during retreat, as regiments dissolved, and as organized units fragmented into small groups, or into individuals focused solely on survival, the question of what to do with eagles became urgent. The officers who were responsible for protecting standards faced choices that had no good options. Understood that continuing to carry eagles through retreat where capture was becoming likely meant risking that standards would be taken as trophies by Russians, who would display them as evidence of French defeat. That symbols of glory would become monuments to catastrophe. That eagles presented by Napoleon would be exhibited in St. Petersburg or Moscow or other Russian cities as testimony to Russian victory and French humiliation. The alternative, destroying eagles or hiding them where they could not be captured, meant acknowledging defeat in permanent way, meant accepting that regiments would return to France without their standards, meant the shame of having lost eagles even if loss was through destruction rather than through capture, meant transforming defeat from military fact into symbolic reality through absence of eagles that should have been carried back triumphantly, but that would not return. We descend into specific decisions that were made the officers who found moments during retreat to bury eagles in unmarked locations, who dug graves in frozen ground and interred bronze birds, and then covered them, leaving no markers because markers would invite discovery, who hoped that eagles might be recovered after war, but who knew that recovery was unlikely, and that burial was more probably permanent, who conducted brief ceremonies before covering standards with earth, understanding that this burial was acknowledgment of defeat and of the end of something that eagles had represented. The ritual of burial was grief, was mourning for regiment that had ceased to exist as organized unit, was acknowledgment that glory days were ending, was acceptance that campaign had failed, and that survival now required letting go of symbols that had defined soldiers' identities and purposes. Other eagles were broken, the bronze birds were struck with hammers or axes until they shattered. The staffs were burned or thrown into rivers, the deliberate destruction being chosen over preservation that would lead to capture, the breaking of eagles being symbolic breaking of what they represented, the violence of destruction being expression of rage or despair or simply practical necessity, the fragments being scattered, so that reassembly would be impossible even if pieces were found. The eagles ceasing to exist as objects, while memories of them continued in minds of those who had served under them, and who had watched them being destroyed rather than surrendered. Whispers tell us of eagles that were captured despite efforts to prevent it, the standards taken in battles during retreat when regiments were overrun, the eagles seized by Cossacks or by Russian regular forces who pursued retreating columns, the trophies that were immediately sent to St. Petersburg, where they were displayed in cathedrals or in Kremlin as evidence of Russian victory, and as testimony to extent of French defeat. Each eagle captured was celebrated, was announcement that another French regiment had been destroyed or had lost its honor, was proof that Grande Armée was being crushed, was symbol that reversed its meaning from representing Napoleon's power to representing his failure, from embodying French glory to testifying to French catastrophe. We witnessed the return of those few eagles that survived, carried by officers who had protected them through entire retreat despite cold and starvation and the constant danger, who had maintained responsibility for regimental symbols even when regiments themselves had ceased to exist as organized units, who returned to France with eagles but without soldiers, with standards but without the units that standards represented, carrying symbols of army that no longer existed in meaningful sense, testifying through preservation of eagles to both dedication and to loss, showing that honor had been maintained by protecting symbols even as they had been unable to protect men who had served under those symbols. We sit with what eagles represented beyond their material form, the connection to Roman military tradition that Napoleon cultivated as part of his self-conception as heir to ancient empire, the link between revolutionary French army that had overthrown monarchy and new imperial army that had replaced it, the symbolism of eagles as predators and as symbols of Jupiter and of imperial power, the choice of eagles rather than traditional French royal lilies as indication of new empire's classical rather than monarchical self-conception, the eagles as propaganda tools that worked bidirectionally, serving to inspire when carried forward in victory, and to demoralize when lost in defeat, creating meaning through their presence and through their absence equally. We reflect on symbols and their power that exceeds their material nature, how physical objects can carry meanings that make them more significant than their bronze and wood would suggest, how standards can embody unit identity and honor and history in ways that make their loss catastrophic beyond practical impact. How eagles buried or destroyed testified to ultimate defeat, in ways that accepting capture would have compounded by adding to military disaster, the symbolic disaster of standards being paraded as trophies in enemy capital. How the choice to destroy symbols rather than see them captured demonstrated that even in catastrophe, certain forms of honor could be maintained, though maintaining them required acknowledgement that preservation was impossible. The accounting of eagles after campaign was grim of approximately 200 eagles that had been carried into Russia. Only a fraction returned to France, the majority being buried or destroyed or captured. The absence of eagles when surviving units returned being visible testimony to scale of catastrophe. the symbolic loss accompanying and representing the human losses that were measured in hundreds of thousands. The empty places where eagles should have been carried being monuments to regiments that had been destroyed and to campaign that had consumed them. The eagles that did not return testifying silently, but eloquently to disaster that words struggled to adequately convey. We close imagining eagle being buried in frozen ground somewhere in Russia or Lithuania or Poland. Officer conducting brief ceremony before covering bronze bird with earth, perhaps saying words about honor and duty, and the regiment that no longer existed except in memories of those few who survived. Understanding that this burial was marking end of something that had seemed permanent. That eagle that had been carried forward in confident advance was being hidden in shameful retreat. That symbol of glory was being interred like corpse, that grand armée was dying, and that its death was marked by burial of eagles that had represented its power, and that now represented only loss. The eagles, the symbols, the burials, the honor maintained through destruction, the standards that could not return, forever buried, forever lost, forever testimony to campaign that began with eagles flying forward in sunlight and ended with eagles buried in frozen darkness, hidden rather than captured, destroyed rather than surrendered, testifying that even in catastrophe some forms of honor could be preserved, but that preservation required acknowledging defeat that eagles themselves had come to symbolize. Forever the eagles that were buried rather than captured. Forever. A long retreat route from Moscow. As spring thaw of 1813 melted snow and revealed extent of catastrophe that winter had hidden beneath white blanket, as temperatures rose and frozen ground softened and ice on rivers broke into flows, searchers found bodies, thousands upon thousands of them, frozen in positions they had assumed when cold or exhaustion or wounds finally stopped them, preserved by temperatures that had dropped below freezing and had remained there through winter months. Corpses that cold had mummified, that retained features and clothing, and the personal effects that soldiers had carried, including letters that had survived when soldiers who carried them had not, paper documents that winter had preserved along with the flesh that had sheltered them. We begin with these letters as windows into lives that ended, missives from home written months or years earlier, before campaign began, or during its early stages when soldiers could still send and receive mail, carried through campaigns and battles, and finally through doomed march into Russia and catastrophic retreat. letters that soldiers had kept close even when abandoning heavier possessions, that represented connections to families and homes and lives that had seemed increasingly remote and impossible to return to as campaign devolved into disaster. Letters that outlasted their carriers, and that became evidence of who these frozen corpses had been when they lived, what they hoped for, who mourned them in distant places that would learn of deaths months after deaths occurred. The letters varied in origin and content. Some were from wives describing domestic life in villages where soldiers had been farmers or craftsmen before conscription, expressing longing for husband's return and describing children's growth and seasonal work, and the ordinary progression of life that continued despite war. Wives who wrote not knowing whether letters reached husbands or whether husbands still lived, writing anyway because writing maintained connection, and because hope required expression even when circumstances suggested hopelessness. Some letters were from parents offering advice and prayers and news of home regions, parents who addressed sons with mixtures of pride and anxiety, who expressed confidence in sons' survival, while revealing through worried phrases the fear that survival was uncertain, who wrote about siblings and crops and local events in attempts to keep sons connected to places they came from and might return to if they survived. Some letters were from children, laboriously written messages from sons and daughters who had been taught to form letters and who wrote, "Dear Papa," and simple declarations of love or requests for return. Children who were growing up without fathers and who might barely remember men who received their letters, or who might never have met fathers who left before they were born or while they were infants. Children whose letters testified to relationships that existed more in hope than in experience. Connections maintained through writing because physical presence was impossible. Some letters were from sweethearts, young women who wrote to soldiers they hoped to marry, who imagined futures together, who expressed longing, and who made plans for weddings that would happen after war ended, relationships that were suspended by military service, but that both parties hoped to resume when soldier returned. It is said that finding these letters was discovering humanity. The frozen corpses that lined retreat routes were initially just bodies, were anonymous dead, whose numbers were counted but whose identities were unknown. But letters restored personhood to corpses, made them into individuals with names and families and histories, made clear that each frozen body represented network of relationships that would be shattered by death that had already occurred, but that families did not yet know about. that each corpse was center of circle of people, wife, children, parents, siblings, friends who would mourn when notification arrived, or who would spend years in uncertainty. If notification never came because records were lost or incomplete, we descend into what letters revealed about distance between soldiers' reality and families, understanding the requests from home for things that seemed trivial compared to circumstances soldiers faced. Wives asking for money to repair roof or to buy supplies. Requests that assumed soldier was being paid regularly and had access to funds when reality was that pay was irregular and conditions were desperate. The discussions of ordinary problems, disputes with neighbors, concerns about children's behavior, questions about farm management that seemed absurd when read in context of frozen corpses and catastrophic retreat, that revealed how completely families failed to comprehend what soldiers were experiencing, how inadequate letters were as means of communicating reality of campaign to those who remained in peaceful villages far from war. The expressions of confidence in ultimate victory and in soldiers' safe return, written when victory still seemed possible and when return seemed likely. The optimism that was based on official reports and on assumptions about French military superiority and about Napoleon's genius. The gap between what families believed based on propaganda and what soldiers experienced based on reality growing wider with each month, until they were completely disconnected, until families' understanding and soldiers' reality shared almost nothing except geographical references and names of places that meant different things to those who lived there and those who read about them. Whispers tell us of letters that soldiers had written, but never sent, drafts found in pockets or packs, final versions that had been completed, but never posted, letters describing retreat or expressing despair or saying farewell, letters that violated censorship by discussing casualties or conditions honestly, or by expressing doubt about campaign success. Letters that said what soldiers actually thought rather than what they were supposed to say in letters, that would be read by officers who enforced morale through controlling communication. The unsent letters were testimony to final thoughts that remained unexpressed, to words that soldiers wanted to say to families but could not or did not, to last messages that were composed but never delivered because death came before letters could be mailed, or because mail service had collapsed, or because soldiers understood that honesty would cause pain that they chose to avoid inflicting. We witness specific human stories that letters told, the soldier carrying letter from wife announcing birth of child he would never meet, letter that described infant's name and gender and health, and that expressed hope that father would return soon to meet son or daughter who had been born while father was away. The profound disconnection between life beginning at home and life ending in Russia, between child entering world and father leaving it, between hope represented by birth announcement and despair, represented by corpse frozen in snow thousands of kilometers from home, where that child lived and would grow up fatherless. The soldier carrying multiple letters from sweetheart showing progression from confidence to anxiety to desperation. As months passed without response, letters that became more pleading and more worried and finally more angry as silence continued. Relationship dissolving through distance and through failure of communication, even before death made dissolution permanent. Letters testifying to how war destroyed relationships through separation and uncertainty, even when death did not immediately intervene. We sit with those who found letters, Russian soldiers searching dead for valuables, local peasants collecting what could be used or sold, French officers who were sent after thaw to identify casualties and collect effects that could be returned to families, all encountering letters that made corpses into people, that restored identity to bodies that cold had made anonymous, that testified that these were not just casualties in statistical sense, but were individuals connected to other individuals who would be devastated by losses they did not yet know about. The finders of letters faced choices whether to take letters and attempt to return them to families who were identifiable from addresses written on paper, whether such effort was practical or possible given distances and disruptions that war had created, whether families would want letters returned knowing that return meant confirmation of death, whether it was kinder to let letters remain with dead or to extract them and send them home as last communications and as evidence of how soldiers had died. We reflect on letters as proof of connection that persists even when death severs it, as testimony to relationships that continued in hearts of families even as soldiers who were other half of relationships died in circumstances families could never fully comprehend, as evidence of distance between what was experienced and what could be communicated, between reality of war and peaceful assumptions of those at home who could not imagine conditions that soldiers endured. The letters were attempts at bridging unbridgeable distance, paper and ink trying to maintain human connection across spaces that were measured in kilometers and in experience, trying to preserve relationships that physical separation and radically different circumstances were slowly eroding, trying to say things that mattered when language seemed inadequate to reality that needed expressing. We close contemplating letter found in pocket of frozen corpse, paper preserved by cold that had killed carrier, ink still legible months after death, words written by wife or parent or child still readable and still carrying meanings that sender intended, and that recipient had read perhaps dozens of times before cold stopped him. Letter that had been last connection to home, that had survived when soldier did not, that testified to love, that was real even when person loved was becoming frozen corpse in Russian snow. The letter would eventually perhaps be returned to sender with notification of death, or would remain lost with corpse, in either case becoming monument to connection that death ended, but that paper preserved at least temporarily, frozen words testifying to frozen lives, messages outlasting recipients, communications that arrived too late or not at all, but that testified nonetheless to bonds that war strained, and that death broke, but that letters documented as having existed, as having mattered, as having been real even when circumstances made them seem impossible to sustain. The letters, the frozen pockets, the words that survived, the connections testified to, forever preserved, forever testimony, forever threshold between life that was and death that is, between home that remembered and Russia that killed. Forever the letters found frozen in pockets of the dead. Forever. Throughout campaign, Napoleon had issued bulletins, official communiques numbered sequentially, distributed to newspapers in France and across empire, creating narrative of campaign that emphasized victories and minimized or omitted setbacks, maintaining illusion of success, even as reality in Russia diverged increasingly from official version events. Bulletins serving as propaganda that shaped public understanding of war, that was actually being lost, even as bulletins claimed it was being won, or at least was proceeding according to plan. We begin with earlier bulletins that described advance into Russia, in triumphant terms the victories at Smolensk and Borodino, presented as decisive even though they were Pyrrhic. The capture of Moscow announced as achievement that would force Russian surrender. Bulletins that made campaign seem successful, and that suggested peace was imminent. That failed to mention scale of casualties or difficulty of supply, or gathering cold or Russian strategy of trading space for time. Bulletins that created false confidence in France, while reality in Russia was becoming catastrophic in ways that official communications did not acknowledge, and that censorship prevented alternative sources from revealing. The pattern had been established through years of previous campaigns. Napoleon understood power of controlling information, of shaping public perception through official narratives that emphasized what served his purposes, and that omitted or minimized what did not, of maintaining morale at home by ensuring that news from front was always positive, or at least was not openly negative, of using bulletins as tools of political control as much as means of military communication. The bulletins were widely read, were published in newspapers, were posted in public places, were discussed in cafes and salons and markets, were primary source of information about campaign for vast majority of population who had no other access to events occurring 1,000 kilometers away, were accepted as truth because alternative sources were unavailable or unreliable, or were suppressed by censorship that made questioning official version dangerous. It is said that 29th Bulletin, issued in December 1812, as remnants of Grande Armée struggled back to friendly territory, broke the pattern established by previous bulletins, acknowledged that campaign had failed, admitted that army had been destroyed by winter, provided first official recognition that catastrophe had occurred. Bulletin that could not maintain illusions that previous bulletins had created because returning survivors would soon testify to truth, and because scale of disaster was too great to be hidden or minimized, or explained away through propaganda techniques that had worked when disasters were smaller, and when controlling information was easier. The bulletin was remarkable for its honesty, described cold in terms that approached accuracy, acknowledged that horses had died and equipment had been abandoned, and that army had dissolved into desperate mob, admitted losses that previous bulletins would have concealed, created through its candor a shock that was all the greater because it contrasted so completely with reassurances that previous communications had provided. We descend into impact of 29th Bulletin in France, and across empire the shock of learning that Grande Armée that had marched into Russia 600,000 strong had been reduced to perhaps 20,000 combat-effective soldiers, that hundreds of thousands were dead or captured or missing, that military force that had seemed invincible had been destroyed, that emperor who had seemed undefeatable had presided over catastrophe of scale, unprecedented in modern European warfare. Bulletin that transformed public perception and political calculations and understanding of what was possible, and what limits existed even on Napoleon's power. The initial response was disbelief. The claims seemed too extreme to be accurate, the losses too vast to be real, the contrast with previous bulletins too stark to be reconciled. Some assuming that bulletin exaggerated, or that it was somehow false, or that truth lay somewhere between what bulletin claimed and what people wanted to believe. But disbelief gave way to horror as returning survivors confirmed bulletin's accuracy. The soldiers who struggled back to friendly territory told stories that matched or exceeded bulletins' descriptions, described cold and starvation and death on scale that bulletin had actually understated, if anything, provided eyewitness testimony that made official acknowledgement of disaster undeniable, and that forced recognition that campaign had been catastrophic failure rather than temporary setback. That Grande Armée had been destroyed rather than merely defeated. That hundreds of thousands had died rather than merely suffered casualties that could be replaced through conscription. Whispers tell us of families waiting for news of individual soldiers. The bulletin provided aggregate numbers but not names, described catastrophe in general terms, but did not list who specifically had died or survived, created situation where every family with soldier in Russia waited desperately for information about whether their father or son or husband or brother was among survivors or among dead, where absence of information was agony, and where eventual confirmation often took months to arrive through official channels, or through letters from surviving comrades, or sometimes never arrived, leaving families in limbo of permanent uncertainty about fates of men who had marched away and never returned, and whose deaths were never officially confirmed. The villages across France and Germany and Italy and Poland compiled lists. The men who had marched away compared against men who returned. The accounting showing that entire cohorts were missing, that some villages had lost most or all men of military age, that communities had been devastated not just by individual losses, but by collective losses that removed generation of young men, that destroyed families and disrupted social structures, and created demographic catastrophes that would affect these communities for decades. Gaps in population that would be visible in censuses and in economic life and in social organization for generations after campaign ended. We witness political impact of bulletin, the understanding among Napoleon's enemies that he was vulnerable in ways he had not been before. That Grande Armée that had enforced his will across Europe had been destroyed and could not be immediately replaced despite conscription. That coalition war against him was now winnable in ways it had not been when Grande Armée was intact and seemed invincible. 29th Bulletin serving as signal that sparked formation of new coalition and renewed resistance from powers that had been defeated previously, but that now saw opportunity. Bulletin transforming political landscape by revealing that emperor's power had limits, and that those limits had been reached in Russian winter, that Napoleon could be beaten, and that beating him required not matching him in tactical brilliance, but rather exhausting his resources through prolonged conflict. We sit with questions Bulletin did not answer the fate of particular soldiers whose names were not listed, circumstances of deaths that were described only in aggregate terms, suffering that statistics represented but could not convey, questions from families seeking details that official sources could not or would not provide, silence from military authorities who either did not know details because records had been lost, or who chose not to share details because acknowledging full extent of horror seemed unnecessary or harmful to morale. The gap between wanting to know and being able to know created agonizing uncertainty for families who needed closure, but who received instead only partial information or no information, who were told soldier was missing or presumed dead, but who never learned exactly when or where or how death occurred, who were left with unanswered questions that would remain unanswered because witnesses had died and records had been lost, and because chaos of retreat meant that many deaths went unrecorded, except in memories of survivors who might never be found or questioned. We reflect on bulletins as tools of power that create narratives about reality, that serve political purposes, the official versions that diverge from actual events, when divergence serves state interests, propaganda that maintains control through managing information and shaping perceptions. 29th Bulletin as moment when gap between official narrative and reality became too large to maintain, and when honesty became necessary not because truth was valued, but because continued lying was impossible given that returning survivors would soon make truth undeniable. The bulletin marked transition from age of certainty, where Napoleon's power seemed absolute, to age of doubt, where limits of that power were revealed, from confidence to recognition that empire was mortal, that emperor could fail, that dominance that had seemed eternal was actually contingent on military power that had just been destroyed. We close in silence, not literal silence, but emotional silence that followed Bulletin's publication. Absence of celebration that previous military announcements had sparked. Quiet that settled over empire as scale of loss was absorbed and processed. As families learned through official channels, or through absence of news that soldiers would not return. As understanding spread that campaign had failed catastrophically, and that price of failure was measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and in destruction of military force that had made empire possible. The silence was mourning and shock and beginning of comprehension that this disaster was turning point, that empire's trajectory had changed, that decline had begun, even if decline would take years to complete. The silence that was heavy with knowledge that Russia had broken Grande Armée and that breaking it had broken the empire that army had sustained. That 1812 marked end of era even if end would not be finalized until 1814 or 1815. That bulletin which admitted disaster was also prophecy of disasters yet to come. The silence. The bulletin that confessed catastrophe. The waiting for news that often never came. The grief that followed acknowledgement. Forever quiet. Forever testimony. Forever the silence that followed the bulletins. Forever. Among hundreds of thousands who died during retreat from Moscow, there were deaths that became symbolic of campaign's tragedy in ways that transcended statistics. Individuals whose stories or circumstances made them representations of larger horror, whose particular fates illustrated general suffering in ways that made them memorable, when most deaths were simply absorbed into casualty figures and forgotten, except by families who mourned them. We begin with drummer boys, the young soldiers, often teenagers or even younger children, who marched with regiments and beat drums that maintained marching rhythm and signaled commands during battles, and who played the martial music that accompanied military ceremonies, and that marked daily routines of camp life. Boys who were non-combatants in theory, but who shared all hardships and dangers of campaign, who froze and starved alongside adult soldiers, who died in numbers that were never separately counted, but that contributed to catastrophe's total toll. Boys whose youth made their deaths particularly poignant, and whose presence in military campaigns represented practice of using children in warfare that was common in Napoleonic era, but that seems especially cruel in retrospect. The drummer boys were recruited or volunteered often from military families, sons of soldiers who grew up in camps, and who learned military life from childhood. Boys who were trained to beat specific rhythms that would communicate orders across noise of battle. who learned the calls for advance and retreat and assembly, and all the various signals that drums conveyed in era before electronic communication, who took pride in their skill and in their role, even though role was support rather than combat. They marched with regiments wearing smaller versions of regimental uniforms, carrying drums that were proportioned to their smaller frames, occupying specific positions in column where drum music could be heard, where they served functions that were both practical, maintaining rhythm, signaling orders, and symbolic, representing regiment's youth and future, embodying connection between past soldiers and soldiers yet to come. It is said that one drummer bore his name, perhaps recorded in regimental records that survive or perhaps lost in chaos of retreat, froze while standing, his body discovered still upright when spring thaw revealed what winter had hidden, drum still attached to his small frame, frozen in position he had assumed when cold finally stopped him. Image of drummer boy frozen, standing, becoming symbol of retreat's horror that was told and retold by survivors, and that entered collective memory of campaign, representing innocence destroyed and youth sacrificed and indiscriminate nature of cold that killed children as readily as it killed veterans without regard for age or experience or combat status. The image was powerful because it violated natural order. Children should not die before adults, should be protected rather than exposed to dangers, should be sheltered from war's horrors rather than made participants in them. Boy frozen, standing with drum, seemed to embody everything wrong with campaign and with war itself in single tragic figure. We descend into what drummer boys experienced during retreat, the cold that affected them more severely than it affected adults, because their smaller bodies had less mass to generate and retain heat. The inadequate clothing, because uniforms had been sized for boys' normal bodies, and did not account for layers needed in extreme cold. The rations that were insufficient for everyone, but that left children especially hungry, because their growing bodies needed more nutrition than adults' bodies. The exhaustion that came from trying to keep pace with adults whose longer legs covered ground more easily. Boys struggling to maintain position in retreating columns while carrying drums that had become burdensome as strength failed. Children dying in disproportionate numbers because they were more vulnerable to cold and hunger and disease than adults were. The particular horror of children dying in war was that it violated assumptions about how world should work, the natural order where old die before young, where adults protect children rather than leading them into danger, where innocence is preserved rather than subjected to horrors that would break adults, and that destroyed children even more completely. The drummer boys who died represented betrayal of obligations that adults owe to young, the responsibility to protect, to shelter, to allow childhood to be time of growth and learning rather than time of suffering and death. Obligations that military necessity overrode, that were sacrificed to needs of campaign that required drummers for signaling, and that took boys from families and sent them into Russia, where they would freeze alongside men who should have been protecting them. Whispers tell us of other children who died during retreat, the cantonniers' children who traveled with army, sons and daughters of women who followed regiments providing services like laundry and food preparation, children who should have been home but who were with army because mothers were with army, boys and girls who froze or starved, or were killed during attacks on retreat columns. The sons of soldiers who had brought families on campaign in violation of regulations or with special permission. Boys who were too young to serve officially, but who were too connected to army to be left behind. Children who died not because they were soldiers, but because they were caught in military catastrophe that consumed everyone in its path. The child casualties were never precisely counted, were absorbed into general statistics, were mentioned in letters by those who witnessed particular deaths, were mourned by families who learned of losses through unofficial channels, or who simply never received any information about children who had marched away and never returned. We witness image of frozen drummer boy being discovered, survivors passing corpse and recognizing it as child, seeing drum still attached, and understanding that this boy had carried instrument until moment of death, had maintained his identity as drummer even when drumming was no longer required or possible, had frozen in position that suggested he had stopped and had not moved again, had died where he stood unable or unwilling to continue. Body preserved by cold in stance that seemed almost alive, until closer inspection revealed that life had departed. The image was reported, was told by those who saw it to others who had not, was repeated until it became part of campaign's mythology, was remembered when most individual deaths were forgotten, because it captured something essential about retreat's horror, about the waste of young lives, about catastrophe that consumed everyone, including those who should never have been there. We sit with what drummer boy's death represented: the sacrifice of future for present needs, consumption of youth by military machine that recognized no limits on what could be demanded or destroyed, violation of boundary between childhood and warfare that should exist, but that military necessity routinely violated. Boy's death standing for all children who died in campaign, and for all ways that war destroys innocence and squanders potential, and creates grief that extends beyond immediate loss to encompass loss of everything that child might have become if he had been allowed to grow up. The frozen drummer boy was not only himself, but was symbol represented innocence destroyed, represented youth sacrificed, represented humanity of army that had become so desperate that it could not even preserve its children, represented indifference of cold to considerations of age or merit or deserving. We reflect on why this particular image remained in memory when so many other deaths were forgotten. The power of concrete specific image compared to abstract statistics. Single child frozen standing being more affecting than hundreds of thousands dead in aggregate. Human tendency to connect emotionally with individuals rather than with numbers. Symbolism that condensed vast catastrophe into single figure that could be comprehended and mourned in ways that magnitude of overall disaster resisted comprehension. The drummer boy became the drummer boy, even though dozens or hundreds of drummer boys probably died similarly, became representative even though representation simplified and distorted by making one stand for many, became symbol that outlasted specific details of whose child this was, or where exactly death occurred, or whether image as remembered matched reality as experienced. We close with frozen boy standing in snow beside retreat route, survivors passing and seeing him, and understanding that child has died in circumstances that should never have contained children. That war has consumed even its drummers. That campaign has failed so completely that even non-combatants have been destroyed. Passing frozen boy and carrying image forward in memory, telling story of drummer boy who froze standing, creating symbol that outlasted campaign and that represented all children who were sacrificed to war, all innocence destroyed by circumstances that should never have existed. The drummer boy, the standing frozen corpse, the child destroyed, the drum still attached, forever frozen, forever standing, forever symbol of innocence sacrificed to war's indifference, of youth consumed by catastrophe, of violation of natural order where children should be protected, and where war's horrors should be kept from them. Forever the drummer boy who froze while still standing, forever testimony, forever mourning, forever. In December 1812, as remnants of Grande Armée struggled westward through final stages of catastrophic retreat, as survivors fought through cold and starvation toward safety that seemed always to recede before them. Napoleon made decision that would be controversial then, and would remain controversial in historical memory. He abandoned army, left retreat under command of his Marshal Murat, and traveled rapidly by sleigh back to Paris, racing across winter landscape with small group of officers and aides, moving too fast for Cossacks to intercept, arriving in French capital weeks before armies scattered remnants, returning to empire that had learned of catastrophe through 29th Bulletin, but that had not yet seen physical evidence of disaster in form of returning survivors. Emperor returning, while those who had served him remained in Russia dying or struggling toward friendly territory. Crown returning while army that had upheld crown dissolved behind it. We begin with the journey itself, Napoleon in closed sleigh moving at speed that only imperial authority and urgency could command, changing horses at posting stations, traveling day and night without pause except when absolutely necessary, crossing from Russian territory through Poland and German states back to France in matter of weeks, journey that was secret initially, that was conducted with minimal escort and without announcement because revealing emperor's location would invite attempts at capture or assassination by enemies who would dearly have loved to seize him. The decision to leave army was strategic calculation. Napoleon understood that his presence with retreating forces accomplished nothing militarily. That retreat was primarily matter of survival rather than of command, that individual soldiers' fates would not be significantly affected by whether emperor was with them or was in Paris. But Paris was crucial, was center of political power, was place where threats to Napoleon's authority would materialize if authority seemed weak, was location where new armies would have to be raised through conscription, and where resources would have to be mobilized for campaigns that would come in 1813, as enemies attacked empire that suddenly seemed vulnerable, was seat of power that required occupant who could maintain control and begin rebuilding before opposition could organize effectively. The calculation was that empire could survive loss of army if emperor retained political control and could raise new forces, but might not survive loss of emperor if political vacuum allowed opposition to emerge, or if allies defected, or if the machinery of state that sustained empire ceased functioning for lack of central authority. It is said that army did not immediately know emperor had left. Soldiers continued believing he was with them, or at least somewhere in retreating column. Discovered only gradually that command had passed to marshals, that Napoleon was gone, that they had been abandoned by man they had followed into Russia. Abandonment creating demoralization beyond what cold and starvation and defeat had already created. Sense of betrayal among those who felt that leader who had sent them into catastrophe should at least remain with them through catastrophe's conclusion, rather than fleeing to safety while they suffered. Some understood strategic necessity of Napoleon's return to Paris, recognized that his presence in capital served larger purposes, even if it meant absence from army, accepted that emperor had obligations beyond military command. Others felt differently, believed that Napoleon should have stayed with army through its dissolution. That leadership meant sharing soldiers' suffering rather than abandoning them to it. That decision to leave was failure of obligations that commanders owed to those they commanded. We descend into what Napoleon's return to Paris meant politically. The emperor, arriving before full extent of defeat, was visible in streets, able to control narrative by providing his own account of campaign before survivors could testify to different version, able to use machinery of state to begin rebuilding before opposition could organize, able to frame retreat as setback rather than catastrophe, even though it was obviously catastrophe, able to maintain appearance of control by demonstrating that he personally was undefeated, and that empire continued to function despite loss of army. The return was stage-managed. Napoleon's arrival was announced in ways that emphasized continuity rather than disaster, that presented emperor as returning to resume leadership after temporary absence, rather than as fleeing from failed campaign, that maintained fiction that situation was manageable, and that new armies could and would be raised to defend empire against attacks that were coming. The rebuilding began immediately. Conscription of new classes of soldiers younger than those previously drafted, calls for volunteers, demands on allied states for troops and supplies, diplomatic efforts to maintain alliances that were fracturing as allies calculated whether remaining with Napoleon was more advantageous than defecting to coalition that was forming against him. Propaganda emphasizing that Russia had been defeated by winter rather than by Russians, that catastrophe was natural disaster rather than military defeat, that French military prowess remained intact, and that setback in Russia did not change fundamental balance of power that favored France. The machinery of empire functioned, orders were issued, resources were mobilized, young men were conscripted and trained and equipped. Within months, new armies were being organized that would fight campaigns of 1813. Napoleon demonstrating that personal authority could survive military catastrophe. That losing army did not mean losing power as long as political control was maintained, and resources could be extracted from territories that empire controlled. Whispers tell us of contrast between emperor who returned and army that did not, Napoleon entering Paris and resuming imperial routines, attending ceremonies and meetings, making decisions and issuing orders, living in comfort of palace while survivors of Grande Armée still struggled through Poland and Germany, still froze and starved in final stages of retreat that would continue into January before last survivors reached safety. The protection of emperor took priority over protection of soldiers' resources, were devoted to securing Napoleon's journey and ensuring his safety. Sleigh and escorts and provisions were provided for imperial party, while ordinary soldiers walked without adequate food or clothing or support. Hierarchy visible in who survived comfortably and who died miserably, in distribution of security and supplies that favored those at top while those at bottom suffered and died. We witness soldiers' responses when they learned emperor had left. Some were philosophical, some were bitter, responses varying based on personal circumstances and political views and level of devotion to Napoleon personally versus to France, or to regiments, or to self-interest that military service served. The veterans who had served through multiple campaigns had complicated relationships with Napoleon, recognized his genius, appreciated victories he had led them to, resented losses he had led them through, understood that they were instruments of his ambition, felt loyalty mixed with resentment, followed him because alternatives were worse, or because following was habitual, or because desertion was dangerous, or simply because that's what soldiers did. Followed commanders, even when commanders made mistakes that cost soldiers' lives. We sit with question of what leaders owe to those they lead, whether strategic calculations override moral obligations, whether Napoleon's choice to leave army was pragmatic necessity or unforgivable betrayal, whether judgment depends on prioritizing empire's survival over armies' suffering, or prioritizing human obligations over political calculations. Whether answer differs based on perspective of emperor responsible for millions versus perspective of soldier, abandoned in Russian winter. Whether question has answer or whether it remains moral ambiguity that cannot be resolved definitively, leaving only the fact of what happened. Emperor returned, army did not, crown survived, soldiers died. We reflect on survival of political authority. Despite destruction of military force, Napoleon's power rested ultimately on armies. But armies could be rebuilt more easily than political authority, could be regained if lost. Emperor understanding that maintaining control in Paris was prerequisite for raising new armies that would be needed for defending empire against coalition that formed in 1813. Calculation that preserving crown required abandoning army at least temporarily. Acceptance that some soldiers would die during final stages of retreat, while Emperor was already safe, but that those deaths would not be prevented by his remaining with them, and that remaining would risk larger disaster if political control was lost during his absence. The arithmetic of power that counted political survival as more valuable than solidarity with suffering soldiers, that prioritized institution over individuals, that accepted that leadership sometimes meant abandoning followers for sake of larger purposes that followers might not understand or agree with. We close contemplating Napoleon in Tuileries Palace beginning work of rebuilding, while corpses froze along roads in Russia. Emperor who survived catastrophe that destroyed those who had served him. Crown that returned intact while army that had upheld it did not return at all, political power that continued despite military disaster that should have destroyed it. Napoleon beginning to raise new armies while survivors of old army still retreated. Emperor in comfort while soldiers suffered. Crown and army separated by thousands of kilometers and by experiences that could never be bridged even when physical distances were eventually closed. Power that survived by abandoning those it sent to die. The crown, the return, the army left behind, the survival purchased through abandonment, forever separated, forever testimony to distance between those who command and those who obey, between those who survive comfortably and those who die miserably. Forever the crown that returned without the army. Forever the night deepens now. The stories have been told. The year 1812 has been explored from the gathering of the Grande Armée to its crossing of the Niemen, from the advance through vast Russian spaces to the occupation of burning Moscow, from the retreat through cold that killed hundreds of thousands to the Berezina crossing, where armies' remnants either escaped or remained forever, from eagles buried in frozen ground to letters preserved in frozen pockets, from the 29th Bulletin's confession to drummer boys frozen standing, from Napoleon's return without his army to the silence that followed catastrophe. The Russian campaign of 1812 marked the beginning of Napoleon's fall, though he would fight on for 3 more years, though he would raise new armies and win new battles, though he would demonstrate repeatedly his genius as commander and his resilience as leader. The disaster in Russia changed everything. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The limits of French power were revealed. The coalition that would eventually defeat him was encouraged by evidence that he could be beaten. The Grand Armée that had made his empire possible was destroyed and could never be fully replaced despite conscription that drained France of young men. Rest now. Let these difficult stories settle like snow after storm. Let the cold recede into history where it belongs. Let the suffering be acknowledged but not dwelt upon. Let the lessons remain about hubris and limits, about the price of ambition, about human endurance and human frailty, about what happens when power meets forces it cannot control. The past is gone, but its echoes remain. Sleep now. The night holds you. The silence is earned. The memories rest. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, the Grand Armée marches still, forever advancing toward Moscow that burns, forever retreating through winter that kills, forever caught between the confidence of beginning and the catastrophe of ending, forever testimony to what was risked and what was lost in the year 1812. Sleep well. The campaign is over. The retreat has ended. The survivors have returned or have found rest where they fell. The eagles are buried. The letters are silent. History remembers. Rest.